Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in for another episode of Proof of Vision. Today I'm bringing you a conversation with ZetaChain, with Dennis, who's the head of developer experience for Zeta. And it was a great conversation. If you're into chain abstraction, interoperability, definitely a good episode for that. One of the things that struck me the most, I think, throughout the entire conversation with Dennis was kind of their pragmatic, like slow roll approach that they're taking to scaling. They've got cap limits on how much total value secured they're gonna have based on validator metrics. So basically, they're not gonna take everybody's money and then have no way to secure it. So they really care about security, and you can tell by the way that the Dennis talked about it in the episode. And then the same thing with like integrating new chains. They would rather wait and see how the market responds to a certain chain before they connect to it with Zeta, right? And enable developers to build on Zeta through that chain or connected to that chain. So it was a really, really great episode. Very refreshing to hear how they think about building out Zeta. Because I think a lot of the industry is like the opposite, right? Which is kind of, hey, give us all your money, and we'll figure out security later. We'll figure out how we scale this later. Just give us your money, right? And it was definitely good to see and hear Dennis kind of talk about their approach. So it was a great episode. Obviously, if you enjoy it, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next episode of Proof of Vision. All right, take care. All right, welcome everybody back to another episode of Proof of Vision. Really excited to bring this episode to you today. We've got Dennis. He's the head of developer experience over at ZetaChain. How are you, Dennis?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, Always like to kick things off and start, with the listeners to hear a little bit about your like personal journey. So, what were you doing before you got into crypto? What led you into crypto? And then maybe talk about, what made you want to join what's going on at ZetaChain.
Absolutely. So I started working in crypto in 2019, and before that, I was a front-end developer, basically working on web applications, doing some design work, but I wasn't really into crypto at all. I didn't know much about it. So when I first we participated in a hackathon actually back in 2019. I think it was Paris Blockchain Week, and we won first prize basically. And I just emailed um, people from the Cosmos ecosystem asking if they needed a front end, and they did. So I joined the Cosmos ecosystem, working on websites initially, like the Cosmos Network, Tendermint.com, that sort of thing, and hackathon websites. And then I basically realized that building blockchains with Cosmos SDK is kind of difficult. So I built a CLI tool for building blockchains with Cosmos SDK, and it turned out to be a pretty useful tool that I created a team around it, and we shipped it as first a Starport, then Ignite CLI, and a bunch of blockchains were built using this tool. So uh, some of the top 100 blockchains were actually built with this CLI tool. So that was part of my journey. That's where I kind of learned a lot about how blockchains are built, and uh, generally about interoperability between blockchains. For example, I built the first IBC visualizer in Cosmos in real time. It was pretty exciting to see like blockchains talk to each other in real time for the first time, actually, when it was before it was enabled in production. So so yeah, that's how I got interested in interoperability. And after a while, I uh, decided that I need to change, and uh, joined ZetaChain because, well, the vision behind ZetaChain really aligned with what I thought was important to build, which is make building cross-chain kind of multi-chain applications easier. And ZetaChain is also a Cosmos-based chain, so that was That was pretty cool. And yeah, I joined ZetaChain in 2023. And yeah, I've been building tools and improving developer experience ever since.
Awesome, awesome. Thanks for the context. So I guess segueing right into ZetaChain then. Um, I love this conversation because we've had a couple of interoperability projects on this podcast, in the past, and it's like one of my favorite subjects because if we're really going to like advance as an industry, we've got to solve this problem, right? We've got to figure out how do we make it easier for developers? How do we make the UX better, in crypto for users to kind of abstract away all of this need to like change wallets, to change chains, and let the user really just focus on like what they're here to do and what they want to do on the app level. Um, so that being said, it's one of my favorite parts of the industry to see how far we've come. But like, what would you say is the core differentiator of ZetaChain versus maybe like a CCIP or Layer Zero or Axelar, some of these other interoperability protocols that are building in the same space? What would you say the differentiator is for ZetaChain, and what the vision maybe is for ZetaChain versus theirs?
I think the biggest difference that Zeta Chain brings to the table is uh, it's not just cross-chain messaging or even cross-chain calls, but it's also a platform on which you can build these applications. So it's less about providing this commodity service of moving bytes between blockchains, which is important because otherwise you wouldn't really have interoperability to begin with. But at the same time, I think some of these services, some of these solutions are missing the core, uh, the core value, which is providing developers an environment to build these applications in. And what I mean by this is on ZetaChain, you have an EVM blockchain basically, right? ZetaChain is EVM compatible, and you can write a Solidity smart contract the same way you would write it on Ethereum. But the cool thing about ZetaChain is that this contract has these superpowers, which means you can call this contract from any connected chain like Ethereum, Solana, Bitcoin, right? And this contract can make outgoing calls to all these chains as well. So this makes it much easier to architect a cross-chain application because you have this contract that handles all cross-chain calls, right? So you can still send a message from Ethereum to Base, but what you get in addition to this is this ability to essentially pre-process the message before it reaches the Base network. And this ability to orchestrate cross-chain transactions is really what sets ZetaChain apart. And uh, another way to look at it, because it's a complex subject, right? You can look at it in different ways. Another way to look at it is with messaging, you you have to have contracts on all these connected chains, right? So it's a point-to-point system. And if you want to connect everything to everything, the number of connection just grows, right? So inevitably you end up choosing a chain to be your kind of base chain, not base chain, that name is already taken, your home chain to which all connections are pointing. And you have to choose one of the chains. Maybe it's base, maybe it's BNB, but you have to choose a chain. Otherwise, there's just too many connections in this network. And you end up with something like ZetaChain, something like an ad hoc version of ZetaChain, because you choose a chain. This is your home chain. You have this contract that connects everything to everything. But the fees on that chain, your users still have to pay these fees, right? With ZetaChain, when for incoming calls, you're not paying fees, so it's much more efficient. And we just adopted this hub and spoke model as as an architectural choice, essentially. And I think this really simplifies the development process because the developer doesn't have to kind of reinvent this from scratch. They can just kind of uh, take this take this architecture that we provide and just build on top of this. And I think it's much easier.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. You mentioned the gas bit of it, right? I was doing a little bit of diligence on ZetaChain before we got on the call, and I saw, this concept of like the gas pools, right? Where I think it's like Zeta paired against, ETH, or Zeta paired against BTC, or Zeta paired against, the native gas token, I guess, of these other chains. Explain how those gas pools kind of enable this hub and spoke model in terms of gas optimization. So what do those do, and how does that optimize things for users and developers?
From a technical point of view, ZetaChain has at least two types of pools, right, that the protocol really cares about. I mean, it's an EVM chain, you can deploy any kind of pools there, but we have gas pools, which is currently Uniswap v2. And these pools are mainly used by the protocol in very specific scenarios. For example, when revert transactions are handled and the protocol needs to swap tokens to pay for outgoing transaction fees. That's when the protocol uses Uniswap v2 pools, but most of the liquidity is in more efficient Uniswap v3 pools, which anyone can use. Of course, you can use v2 pools as well, but it's mainly built for the protocol. So there's not much liquidity there, only for like the small amounts that the protocol needs. But the majority, the most of the liquidity is in v3 pools or in algebra pools and other sorts of pools on ZetaChain. But the core thing is that ZetaChain has this ability to represent assets from connected chains on ZetaChain in a form of ZRC20 tokens. And ZRC20 is basically, again, a representation of a token. For example, there is BTC on Bitcoin, but there is ZRC20 BTC on ZetaChain. And what this means, what this makes possible is for contracts to essentially operate on these assets from connected chains. So users make a call from Bitcoin to universal contract on ZetaChain. They send some BTC, and your contract on ZetaChain gets ZRC20 BTC version of the token, and you can swap it for another token. And that's where also Zeta comes in, because, as you said, there are pools paired with Zeta, so it just makes easier to swap between assets, and there are on-ramp mechanisms to Zeta. So it's it's a utility token for cross-chain transactions involving value transfer. It just makes it easier to swap between different kinds of assets. But the ZRC20 mechanism allows assets to be transferred to ZetaChain and withdrawn back from ZetaChain. And that's what we call universal liquidity, because it pools all the liquidity from connected chains. So you don't necessarily have to rely on dexes on these connected chains to move supported assets between blockchains. So there's a lot, there are many ZRC20 assets already on ZetaChain, and you can use these pools that already exist paired with Zeta to swap between assets on ZetaChain and then withdraw instead of relying on dexes on these connected chains.
Alchemix Finance empowers you to spend and save at the same time with a self-repaying, interest-free, non-liquidatable loan. Deposit your assets and access your future yield today. Available on Mainnet, Arbitrum, and Optimism. Head to alchemix.fi to get started.
Gotcha. It makes a lot of sense. And I think, one of the things you guys have enabled too is kind of this, you've kind of, with Zeta Chain, applied on top of something like Bitcoin, right? You've kind of added this programmability onto Bitcoin, which I find very significant, in terms of like, how are we going to keep growing as an industry I think in the short to medium term, it's going to be unlocking, Bitcoin liquidity. There's so much idle Bitcoin, right? That's not really brought on chain or really used in like these EVMs, or the SVM, you name it. And typically you've got to have a wrapper, right? So you've got to have like, wrap Bitcoin, or one of the other, models that have come out since then. But for Zeta Chain, I think, you guys have enabled like kind of bypassing that, where you can use native Bitcoin, on Zeta Chain or on Zeta Chain connected universal apps. So talk about that a little bit. Like what does that open up for maybe Bitcoin holders, for developers that want to build, with Bitcoin or on Bitcoin? Talk about that a little bit.
I think the problem with wrapping is not the actual process of wrapping, right? Wrapping is just taking an asset, putting it into a custody, locking it somewhere, right, and minting uh, an asset that represents the original asset, right? It's just a technical operation. There's nothing wrong with it. The problem is when this process is exposed to end users, when users have to know about this process, about how it actually happens, right? It's the same thing about like programs on your laptop, right? When you double click on an app, right? You don't think about how it was compiled, right? It's completely under the hood. Same thing should happen with wrapped assets. So, for example, when a user interacts with Universal App on ZetaChain with BTC, what they effectively doing is they're broadcasting a Bitcoin transaction with native BTC using the wallet that they already have, like Unisat or Xverse or OKX, right? So they're just interacting with Bitcoin, but under the hood, this BTC goes into ZetaChain Validator custody. A wrap version, essentially ZRC20 BTC, is minted, deposited into the contract that they're interacting with, and the contract can take the ZRC20 BTC and swap it for another asset and withdraw it to another blockchain. But all of this happens under the hood without users ever kind of knowing about it. And I think that's the main advantage, the UX effects that this brings, right? That a user just takes their BTC, uses that to send it to an app, and they get something else on the other side. And so yeah, the problem is not technically with wrapping, but with the UX that is associated with poor implementation of value transfer and cross-chain calling when users like let's quickly explore like the alternative, right? What would a user do? They would take their BTC, send it to a bridge address, for example, right? And wrap BTC will be issued on Ethereum and transferred to the user. Then a user would have to install an EVM wallet, somehow acquire ETH for gas, learn how to swap wrap BTC for something else. Then like 90%, more than 90% of users are going to drop off at this point because it's just too complicated. And you can't do it in a one step, right? It's not like you're pressing a button and Bitcoin gets immediately transferred to Ethereum. You have to wait, and then once the process is done, you have to issue another transaction, like maybe 20 minutes later. So what kind of experience is that, right? You want all of this to happen within a single atomic transaction. It doesn't have to happen in a single block, right, across all chains, because blockchains run at different speeds. They have different block producing mechanisms, right? It's virtually impossible to synchronize all the chains, and you really don't need to, as long as the user isn't exposed to all the complexity that happens under the hood. So with ZetaChain, it's just like one click in a Bitcoin wallet, and everything else just happens automatically. It doesn't happen in an instant, but a user doesn't need to sit and wait for bridging to be processed and issues transactions worry about gas. And the gas element is really important here, because when a user, let's say a simple scenario, I have BTC and I need to send you some USDC, right, on Ethereum. I don't have ETH. I don't care much about Ethereum. I certainly don't have USDC. So what I do is I choose an app that I like, right? Send a transaction with some BTC. It gets swapped under the hood for USDC and withdrawn to your address. And a fraction of this BTC gets swapped and used as gas asset, right? Because for this process to happen, someone has to pay the gas fee on Ethereum, but it all happens automatically. So and it can be, of course, calculated in advance. So you just include a bit more BTC to cover gas costs, but you never have to worry about the actual gas token that is being used.
Gotcha. Yeah, so you guys have kind of abstracted away all of this kind of like gas process. Even if the gas is paid in Zeta, for example, like so would a user still need to purchase Zeta, or that all happens under the hood as well, to pay for gas, like for some of these transactions?
Yeah, it's completely under control of the contract that a user is interacting with. So it's up to the contract to decide how to provision gas. And the most common scenario, I mean, there are a couple of scenarios. One is the incoming amount. The contract just takes a fraction of the incoming token and swaps it for the gas fee. And this way, uh, I mean, it's very simple. The alternative, if you can like pre-fund your contract with tokens just so that it has gas fees, might not be practical for expensive chains like Ethereum, but for like other chains, it could be possible where you kind of subsidize these costs.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and yeah, I mean the further along the progression line of getting all that out of the user's head, and again making it so they don't have to worry about these, just kind of these architecture or technical problems. They can just worry about, okay, I wanna send BTC to this chain, or I don't know, I want to borrow against my BTC on X chain, and use it on another chain. As much as we can, abstract away that as possible is amazing. And one thing I think is interesting as well about we were talking about Bitcoin, a second ago, is, you know, uh, uh, WBTC and some of these wrappers introduce, like counterparty risk as well, right? Where you're now exposed to whoever the counterparty that's running, rep Bitcoin, and I think there was couple of months ago there was a big hiccup about Justin Sun's involvement with WBTC, and the effects that was going to have on the asset. And it's like you don't want to have the user have to worry about that, just because they chose to wrap with a certain asset. And I think that's something that ZetaChain unlocks as well, is not having to worry about maybe like counterparty risk like that. I mean, would you agree with that? Is that something that is solved as well, with the ZetaChain application?
Yeah, of course, because when you're transferring value, the ZRC20 version of the asset could exist only for the duration of a transaction, right? And this is just done for accounting purposes. So we're trying to minimize the risk that users are exposed to by reducing the amount of time that the wrap version kind of exists, right? So if your goal is to just turn one asset into another, then this wrap version only exists for this transaction, and it's not transferred to a centralized entity. It's always in the custody of ZetaChain validators. So there's no centralized bottleneck. There is no a single machine sequencer anywhere, right? It's all a network of validators voting on transactions and processing them, and keeping them secure through TSS MPC. But and that's one of the reasons why we're pushing the use of native assets, because we think it's important that users don't get Zeta chain wrap BTC on Ethereum. Like that would be counterproductive. That would be like intentionally making the experience worse, because nobody wants to see those wrapped assets unless they they want to, right? Like if they so for example, their applications on Zeta Chain, and you might want to send some BTC to Zeta Chain in advance just to kind of reduce the time that it takes to interact with these applications. But that's your intentional decision to send BTC in advance to hold some ZRC20 BTC. That's totally possible. But if you just want to move assets around, then you're not really dealing with wrapped assets at all, especially on connected chains. Like we're not gonna ever have wrapped uh, uh, assets on connected chains just for the purposes of, like, I mean, that's just counterproductive, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean that's honestly, in terms of like security too, I think that's a big unlock. I mean, I think everybody, probably most people, if you're around this long in crypto now, probably had a little of their net worth burned when the multi-chain hack happened, or not. When that all went down, I mean, like, it took an entire chain down, right? It took Phantom, basically screwed them, took them to zero, basically. And so, like, for I guess the question for you is, like, how far do you think that the interoperability space has come since then, to maybe, like, avoid similar circumstances like that in the future? Whether it's something like ZetaChain, with, like, their validator sets. How far do you think the industry's come since then? Because I think a lot of people, I think Sam, from Frac, Sam Kazemian, was famous in saying that the biggest risk to crypto is bridges. It's like the biggest point of failure, largest kind of catastrophic moments can happen with some of these bridging applications. So, like, what do you think about that, and how are you guys ensuring that, like, those things can't happen?
So with ZetaChain, and I agree, bridging is difficult. You're putting a lot of assets in a single place, right? And just hoping that nobody's gonna hack it. So the way ZetaChain kind of tries to prevent that from ever happening, or like reduce the possibility of that happening, is by storing these assets, at least native gas assets, in regular address through TSS, right? So it's not a contract, is just a regular address, and through MPC validators have ability to collectively sign outgoing transactions. So as by reducing the complexity of the implementation, we're trying to make sure that nothing like this can ever happen, because it's very hard to hack an address. I mean, hack an account, a regular account, not a smart account, because you would just have to have all the fragments of the private key, which are distributed among validators between different entities. So decentralization really, really helps here, because there is no single private key that can act on behalf of these assets, right? And ERC20 assets are stored in a very simple ERC20 custody contract. So we're kind of separating the actual interoperability logic from the logic that holds the assets. And of course, there are many mechanisms in place to secure this, like liquidity caps. So there is an artificial limit on how many assets can be deposited into ZetaChain, to ensure that the amount does not exceed the amount that ZetaChain is prepared to secure, right? We don't, I mean, it would be great to have more value on ZetaChain, but we want to be very careful about not having too much value secured at every given time. So that's one thing. The other one is there are mechanisms to pause operations, like if something suspicious going on, like before anything happens, there are mechanisms to pause. There is rate limiting in place. So there are a lot of mechanisms that secure the 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 network and cross-chain interactions. And of course, relying on native assets rather than wrapped assets is the way to go. So, like, once you hold your BTC in your own custody, right? And when you send USDC to someone on Ethereum, they're going to get it in a native USDC form, and they're going to be responsible for holding them, right? So you want to minimize the amount of kind of responsibility we're taking on, and just provide the service. Of course, if the app lives on ZetaChain, then it's just secured by the network. And again, it's all decentralized. So there's never a single point of failure. There's no centralized bottleneck in this whole system, which also really helps.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And probably the most interesting thing to me that you just said was kind of like that scaling limit that you guys are imposing on yourselves, where you're not going to take on more value than your validator set is ready to secure. Which I think is interesting, and it's the right approach, right? And it's like, I think you said it right. I think most protocols out here are just like, no, like, we want it all. Like, give us all the value, right? We we'll figure out the safety later, But I think hearing you guys kind of take that that based approach, right? Where, you're not going to do that unless you have the validators to support it. Makes sense, right? So, but then the question becomes, in terms of scaling, um, like how do you guys envision, or what's the growth strategy around increasing the validator set, or growing the number of validators on ZetaChain, so that way you can continue to onboard more and more value? Maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think the goal is not necessarily to increase the number of validators. In fact, we're looking to manage this number. Like we're actually reducing the validator set, but with proof of stake blockchains, it's not about the number of validators. Of course, we can just set like 500. Anyone can join. Like we can start a validator right now, and like. But is this validator going to have enough voting power to actually matter? No, it's just going to be a number, right? But we don't want the just numbers, right? We have 500 validators. There's no point in that. The name of the game is making sure that the voting power is distributed more evenly, and that's what we want to achieve, right? We are more than comfortable having 60 validators, but if we can make sure that the voting power is more evenly distributed, means that uh, the 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 decisions are not made by two or three or five entities. They're like every block is voted on by 10, 20 validators, right? So, and that's what we're doing. And of course, increasing utility of ZetaChain, making it a better platform for developers to build on top of. Like all of this contributes to ZetaChain being able to secure more assets. But in general, we're kind of playing the long game. We're not in it to just inflate the numbers, right? That's ridiculous thing to do, right? We want to build a secure platform, and that's why we're self-imposing these uh, these limits, just to always be on the safe side and prioritize security of assets first.
This episode is brought to you by Pendle. Pendle is a leading protocol in the DeFi yield sector, operating as a permissionless yield trading protocol, facilitating the tokenization and splitting of any yield-bearing assets in DeFi. This allows users to speculate on future yield or earn a fixed rate on their assets. Learn more at pendle.finance.
Gotcha. No, it makes sense. It's refreshing to hear, because I think there's a lot of the opposite train of thought going on, in a lot of different parts of DeFi, right? But you talked about, okay, like, we want to make it more attractive for developers to build on ZetaChain. That's one way that you grow, obviously. So one of those things is, for developers, is obviously like the number of chains that you guys support. And you guys have a vast variety. Like, I think, like you said, you've got the EVM. I think you've got Solana. You've recently, I think, announced testnets for TON, for SWI. So you guys have kind of solved this complex problem of, there's all these VMs, that keep coming online. There's going to be more and more and more of these things, and you've got to be able to, as a developer, I think, go to like something like ZetaChain to simplify all that, to just get your app distributed out to all these places, as easily as possible. But like, what do you guys look at, or what do you guys think about in terms of when you do want to integrate, maybe an up and coming project? Like, what are some of the things that you guys think about before you start doing the legwork to integrate that project? Are you guys looking at a certain metrics? What's that process like, and how long does it take to implement a new VM, or a new chain, onto ZetaChain?
We're trying to integrate chains that are widely used, right? So of course it's tempting to integrate the hot new chain that was just released, but at the same time, dropping support for a chain after it goes out of business is painful, right? We don't want developers to have to go through that, right? So that's why we're prioritizing chains that are here to stay and that have existing user base, right, that needs interoperability and wants to wants their chain to be more connected to other blockchains. So that's why Ethereum base, Solana, Bitcoin, other chains. That's one factor that we take into account is how widely used the chain is, how established it is. The second one is how how a chain is connected already. So for example, there is TON network, and it's not well known for its interoperability, right? It's not that well connected to other chains like Bitcoin. And there are many users on TON. So one of the reasons why we wanted to connect TON is because it's underserved by interoperability solutions, right? The bridges that exist to TON, to my knowledge, are mostly centralized, and they're not to the standard of what we're building. So what we did is we connected TON to make sure that developers can build universal apps that natively can accept calls and value from the TON network, making it possible for developers on TON to build cross-chain swaps, lending, integrate with Bitcoin, all of this. So yeah, I guess those are the two main reasons. We don't really, um, I mean, the complexity of integration is important, but if something is really valuable in terms of integration, we're gonna spend the time and resources to integrate it, like we did with Bitcoin, with Sui and TON, right? Those are um, very much different from EVM. In terms of time, integrating new EVM chains requires virtually no coding on our side, which is great that we could reach to this point where it's just like if it's an EVM chain, most likely it's just going to work out of the box. So in that area, that's why we could scale to Avalanche Arbitrum very quickly, because those are chains that are very compatible with everything that we've integrated so far. Integrating other VM chains can take time. I don't remember how much time we spent, but I would say roughly like 1 to 2 months. But what we're doing is we actually have this, and I mean, I'm developer experience, so I'm a bit biased, but we have this tool called LocalNet for developers, which is essentially running the whole thing like ZetaChain and all connected chains on your machine without testnets, without internet connection, just locally. And we're integrating new chains there first. So it's much quicker this way because we can get feedback from developers and we can integrate it as quickly as like 1 week. I think it took us 1 week to add SUI support on LocalNet. And of course, it's easier because it's just TypeScript. It's much faster to integrate. We don't have to worry about security, about anything, because it's just a developer tool. And of course, it takes more time to integrate on testnet and mainnet because we want to take all the edge cases into account, go through security audit. But as a proof of concept and as a developer tool, like we can do it very, very quickly. And that's what we did with Sui and TON in the past couple of months.
Nice, nice, and yeah. So I mean, and again, you mentioned you can do things to make it quicker, but it does take time, 1 to 2 months, right? For most VM. So like that kind of becomes to me like in terms of like a business decision and trying to analyze that. You're trying to predict, I guess, if you're going to start working on something, you got to predict 2 months into the future. Is this chain still going to be here? Do we still think that there's going to be users here, etc.? And so we kind of get to this paradigm right now where it's usually airdrop hunting, right? There's a new chain coming out. There's a ton of volume and users and TVL shifting to that chain. But in 2 months, does that capital like migrate elsewhere? I think Barachain's a good example of this right now, where it had a lot of hype coming in. There was a ton of TVL there, and now like a lot of things are, and this isn't a shot at Barachain, but price is down. I think TVL is down a little bit. So like, how do you guys assess something like that? Like how would you assess Barachain in terms of, it's kind of been this hot chain, just came out. It's got this unique mechanism, but how do you like assess that staying power, I guess? That's very difficult to do.
It is, but I guess there's no better indicator than time, right? You just wait for chains to become established and see where they end up, right? We just chasing trends and integrating the most hyped up chain right now is just not the way to go. We're going to be spending valuable time and resources on chasing something ephemeral, and what's the point when we can actually spend time on chains that are here to stay? And I'm not saying that new chains are not here to stay. We just need to let users and the industry to make that kind of decision. And I know it's more of a conservative approach, but I think for a platform that is built for developers to kind of build reliable cross-chain applications, it's more important to be connected to established chains and not drop support, because nothing's worse than like having to announce we're dropping support for this chain. Like, why did you integrate it in the first place? So, and there are many very interesting chains that are established. I'm sure that we can integrate, and some of them are not super uh, are not new at all, right? And some of them are underserved. For example, like Dogecoin, right? It's an ancient chain, but it doesn't have like smart contracts, and um, maybe this is a good candidate. I'm not saying we're integrating that chain, but we're definitely looking into different chains, especially the ones that don't have smart contract support, just to make them more connected.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And too, that could be a big boon for, for in terms of market share for, Zeta Chain. Like if you provide that first, I guess, the first frontier of programmability for Dogecoin or Dogechain or like some of these other ones, right? That opens up a whole like developer set, a whole user group that really didn't have much to do on chain until that moment. So I think that makes sense from like a growth perspective as well. But no, so yeah, we're coming up on the end of our conversation. It's been really enlightening. Before we do though, I always like to ask you like, what's got you the most excited on the roadmap for Zeta Chain? What's coming up? Could be from a developer standpoint or like something cool you think is coming up for users. What's got you excited, for Zeta Chain in the next couple of months?
I think there are many features we're working in parallel, but improving the speed at which cross-chain transactions are processed, I think is very exciting because that directly impacts user experience. So recently, there's this project called Speedrun, for example, that is using intent-based system to essentially speed up cross-chain transaction value transfer between connected chains and Zeta chain. So this is super exciting. It takes just, I don't know, like 10 seconds for a transaction to go through. And yeah, I'm watching closely at this project to see where this is going to go. Uh, Connecting new chains, improving developer experience. We have solutions for developers like universal NFTs, universal tokens. This is super exciting, where you can like mint an NFT on one chain and users can move it to any other blockchain. We're working on Solana version of universal NFTs right now. This is super exciting because yeah, like fungible tokens, NFTs are basic building blocks, and making them cross-chain is important, and we want to extend that to other chains as well. So yeah, I would say we have the foundation in place, improving speed, adding new features like universal tokens, and adding new chains, ability to stake Zeta from contracts, and this is going to be very powerful because other chains have ability to stake native tokens from contracts, but we're connected to other blockchains, which means cross-chain programmability of this feature. And I'm very excited about that because that's going to mean users will be able to stake BTC and secure and use BTC to secure ZetaChain, for example. So this is pretty exciting in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are awesome developments, and we'll be keeping an eye on them over here at Alia Research for sure. So yeah, no, Dennis, thanks for your time. Really, really enlightening. For anybody listening to this, obviously check out the show notes. We'll link, obviously to where you can find ZetaChain. Keep your eye out on Alia Research as well. We'll have some research content coming out on ZetaChain to help the users in their journey of kind of getting educated on the complexities of Zeta and the things that you guys are doing. And yeah, we appreciate it. Thanks everybody, and we'll see you on the next episode of Proof of Vision. Take care.
Thank you so much.